Running a learning business today requires attention to growing reach, generating revenue, and demonstrating real impact, all while navigating constant change and fierce competition for learners' time and money.
To help, we've curated a collection of free resources for learning business professionals. You'll find frameworks, briefings, and reports, webinars, and tools focused on strategy, portfolio design, pricing, marketing, and more, all created specifically for organizations that sell continuing education and professional development.
If you care about building a stronger, more sustainable learning business, visit leadinglearning.com/free resources.
That's leadinglearning.com/free resources for practical tools and strategic insight to help you grow your reach, revenue, and impact.
If you want to grow the reach, revenue, and impact of your learning business, you're in the right place. I'm Celisa Steele.
I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast. Too many learning businesses are trying to evaluate their success by looking in the rearview mirror. By the time the data shows a learner is struggling, it's often too late to help.
In this episode, number 485, I talk with Steven Khraiss, who heads data strategy and analytics at Holmes Corporation. Our conversation is structured around a Holmes ebook, The Association Leader's Guide: How to Turn Learning Data into Personalized Member Experiences.
Steven makes the case that the shift from lagging indicators like enrollment counts and completion rates to real-time and predictive analytics is achievable for most associations, and the cost of waiting is rising faster than many leaders realize.
Steven and I get into how to create an engagement score and what it enables, why Holmes deliberately left any mention of AI out of the ebook, even though AI is powering so much under the hood, and why Steven names culture, not technology, as the harder challenge in becoming data-driven.
And Steven offers a practical first step for any learning business leader who sees the value but doesn't know where to begin. Start with a question you wish you could answer.
So, Steven, for listeners who may not be familiar with Holmes Corporation, HC, give us a quick sketch of what y'all do, who you serve, and how you serve them.
Yeah, absolutely. So Holmes Corporation, we partner with professional associations to design, build, distribute knowledge and skills assessments, our flagship certification preparation, but we've also branched out into micro-credentials as well as other learning programs globally, which really, the goal driving member engagement and revenue at scale. I like to say it's, turning those learning programs that actually move careers. So that's the gap we kind of fill. We partner with some of the largest in the world: SHRM, ASCM, ICF, APIC, AFCPE, Payroll Org. But, the differentiator there is we span many different verticals: HR, supply chain, coaching, healthcare, finance, and, everything from moving from market analysis, content, marketing, sales, ongoing customer care. I'd like to say we're not just a platform vendor, and we really try to help associations meet their end goals. And my role kind of in this data and analytics layer kind of sits underneath all that. And that's the part that lets our partners actually see what's working and what's not. So we keep evolving as our association partners' needs do.
Well, speaking of data, the impetus behind this conversation is an ebook that Holmes released called The Association Leader's Guide: How to Turn Learning Data into Personalized Member Experiences. And I know that when I read that publication, it mentions 3 converging trends that are really driving the importance of having good learning data now. So the rising accountability expectations from stakeholders, the reskilling imperative that's creating demand for learning programs, and then external and competitive pressure to really keep pace. So if you had to pick one of those, what do you see as the biggest driver of urgency right now for learning businesses? Or maybe it's something other than those 3 at this point, but I would love to hear what you think is really driving urgency now.
Absolutely. I would say all 3 are very real, but if I have to pick one, and the one that's creating the most urgency, not only this year, over the past 5 years, I would say is accountability. association boards or enterprise partners, just association partners themselves are kind of, asking a sharper question now of what did we actually get for this investment? As budgets become tighter and every learning dollar and kind of in this role having to, balance a budget, and it's harder than it was years ago. But in simply saying enrollment was up is not just the acceptable answer anymore. And the reskilling wave is real. I know we quote some stats in the ebook, but the World Economic Forum says 59 or 60% of workforce, need reskilling by 2030. And 95% of organizations today have ongoing and upskilling efforts underway per the Workday's 2025 data. So in my mind, the demand is not theoretical anymore. And regarding competition, and we frame it in the ebook well, but the gap between the real-time insights and a static quarterly PDF or weekly is the difference from knowing how the training is working and just hoping it does. But they're all pushing in the same direction. And I've kind of actually living this firsthand when rebuilding our data foundation and infrastructure, and having to connect different systems into a unified data lakehouse, really so we could answer what did we actually get out of this investment, and without just an evidence of we got some cool things. So when I say accountability is the driver, it's kind of what we built for.
And you were talking there about some of the things that maybe historically organizations have relied on, maybe things like enrollment counts and completion dates, but the ebook makes the point that those are lagging indicators. And so they give you kind of limited visibility into, is this program actually working, actually making a difference? What are the risks when learning businesses rely on those kind of data, those lagging indicators to tell them, is this working?
Yeah, excellent question. I would say the core problem is timing. So, like I mentioned, the numbers tell you what already happened if you're not working with real time. And so by the time something looks bad, or you see learners progression fall off, you've usually already lost them at that point. So while enrollment was up 10%, sounds great in a board deck or displays well in a report, it doesn't really tell anything of whether anyone's actually learning anything within a core set of products. And so in the ebook, we do break it down into 4 kind of costs: the delayed intervention. So you spot a struggling learner that's maybe too late to help, or limited accountability. It's kind of hard to prove ROI to leadership with just what I call those surface level metrics. And then 3, the resource strain. So having to pull, and I've lived this again, manual reports and trying to maybe chase learners one-to-one, it just doesn't scale. And 4 is kind of those missed broader patterns of, you can see what's working, what's not with learners, and what are they actually doing within products. And so every one of those 4 problems, I would say, is what kind of that real time or near real time, whatever, visibility and predictive scoring are essentially built to solve it. And so relying on my sports references, it's like coaching a game off of the final score. It's accurate, but it may be too late to change anything versus having to go back and review. And
so you began to talk there a little bit about those real time, but then even beyond that, the predictive analytics. So what does it look like when a learning business shifts from that reactive lens to a predictive lens? And what does that mean? I'm thinking both internally for staff at the learning business, but also for those learners that learning business serves.
Yeah, reactive, I would say, is reading the autopsy, and predictive is really reading the vital signs. So for it to work, the model needs history, some of those validated signals, whatever the key performance indicators, and then the outputs, I would say, that translate into the next step and not just a scary number. So for staff, I would say the shift really viewing reporting kind of in a proactive approach, and that doesn't just replace it. For learners, it helps show, for example, if they're unengaged, it's going deeper than a, hey, we miss you kind of message versus where they are actually in their journey. And we've seen this pay off in our own analysis and data. From a member and learner perspective, we analyze thousands and thousands of learner records across various dimensions, membership status. Typically, our products will have initial pre-test, so we measure engagement there. And then if it's a cert prep product, we have what we call a practice exam. So we measure engagement with those, and then overall engagement with the product. And we've seen engagement in the practice exam behavior is one of the single biggest levers. So then we can design nurture programs that say, hey, we noticed that, Celisa, you're planning to take your test in 2 weeks. It's very vital that if you haven't yet, please take your practice exam, and it'll just give you that peace of mind and framework that I think really makes a difference.
Running a learning business today requires attention to growing reach, generating revenue, and demonstrating real impact, all while navigating constant change and fierce competition for learners' time and money.
To help, we've curated a collection of free resources for learning business professionals. You'll find frameworks, briefings, and reports, webinars, and tools focused on strategy, portfolio design, pricing, marketing, and more, all created specifically for organizations that sell continuing education and professional development.
If you care about building a stronger, more sustainable learning business, visit leadinglearning.com/free resources.
That's leadinglearning.com/free resources for practical tools and strategic insight to help you grow your reach, revenue, and impact.
One of the things that the publication talks about is this idea of an engagement score. And for those individual learners, you have this idea of, okay, how engaged are they? And that's, I think, based primarily on activity in the platform and logging in, and have they completed certain modules, those sorts of things. But maybe talk a little bit more about the engagement score, how it works, but then maybe even more importantly, what having that engagement score then enables for an organization.
At sort of the simplest level, an engagement score can answer one question extremely fast. In your kind of ecosystem of learners, who's thriving and who's quietly slipping away? So it's built off of those behavioral signals, like you mentioned, platform activity, login frequency, how long per session are they engaged? Is it 10, 20 minutes versus 2.5 hours? How are they moving through the various modules? And then with that, their assessment activity, whether it's taking quizzes or if we have flashcards built into the product or downloading various items. And so when you consolidate all of that and put it together, that engagement score is, we like to think of it as, reflecting the likelihood of finishing the program successfully, whether that's ultimately taking a certification exam or earning a micro-credential. And what it really unlocks at scale is, for the exam, without having to dig into individual learner trends, it kind of helps you see the overall macro picture. But I always have one honest caveat there, is the score is only as good as the behaviors you feed it. So if you keep it tied to real learning, not vanity clicks, the mental model I use is, it's like, think of a credit score for engagement, one number, many different behaviors, and it moves and shifts over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what does talk about what the engagement score actually is? I mean, is it a scale? Is it a number between, 0 and 10? Is it you're categorizing learners into specific tiers? Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So we'll look at kind of the wider data set and based on trends. So whether engagement with nurture programs, whether it's an email campaign or an SMS triggered campaign, and we'll assign various scores, and they're mostly weighted. So if we know, for instance, a practice exam is, a high driver, then we might give a learner a score of 20 points, or, you could set your scale to whatever is relevant to the business. But that combined, and so then you kind of create these tiers of low engagement, middle, high, super high, or, super user. And time again, we'll run these analysis, and we always say around the office, if you use the learning system or our products as they should be intended, you will have a higher likelihood of success.
And so, in essence, that engagement score then gives the provider of that content a sort of shorthand way to see who is most engaged, perhaps offer encouragement to those who aren't as engaged, maybe offer kudos to those who are very engaged. And so it's about kind of then, I guess, providing the appropriate feedback and incentives along the way to keep the learners going.
Yeah, you just hit something right on the head there. So we'll have kind of tap on the shoulder nurture campaigns where a learner may be interactive and engaged early on, say for a certain time period, and then maybe they fall off. Life happens, or you get kind of down this runway of, yeah, I'm going to really engage here. And so we have triggered campaigns that say, hey, Celisa, you've been absent for a couple of weeks. Let's get back and focus and do X, Y, and Z. And likewise, if a learner is really engaged, we have campaigns that praise them along the way. So yeah, it's it's kind of that full end-to-end kind of journey. It's almost like a coach that's cheering you on throughout a game or throughout your sports journey.
I see you're back to sports again there, Steven.
Yeah.
So in the publication, there's no mention of AI, which is maybe a bit surprising, given that this is a piece focused on learning data, focused on personalization. So I want to give you a chance now, Steven, to go on record and talk about the role of AI in making effective use of learning data.
I'm really glad you're asking this one. And honestly, it was a strategic decision. We left off the word AI, throughout the piece on purpose, because the fact is it's already in there, and not just as kind of the buzzword of AI, but because in my mind, most association leaders don't really want AI for its own sake. They want the outcomes that it delivers. So when you look under the hood of the ebook, it's all there. When we talk about the predictive risk scoring, the engagement score, behavioral automation that fires off the personalized nudges based on how the learner is interacting, that is essentially the machine learning doing the useful work quietly in the background. And through those kind of automation processes and workflows, we've seen real results where, cutting our partners' workload by in one instance over 45%. And we've seen more than 3 times the industry average in terms of open rates and click rates with our email campaigns. So we chose to really lead with the result, I guess, instead of the buzzword. But the flip side is, I would say, the guardrail. So AI is obviously an accelerant, but not always the foundation. So we're big at HC. If the data is fragmented and ungoverned, then AI will just scale that mess faster. It's kind of the common analogy is garbage in, garbage out, but AI at machine warp speed. And even though I'm a huge tech guy, I feel like the technology should disappear behind the result. So in my mind, if the member feels seen, it really doesn't matter if it's AI or a person. And, that's generally the whole kind of premise. So AI can be the accelerant, but not necessarily the foundation. And the associations, at least in our experience, that won't have the flashiest AI, but they have the clean data to trust.
I think that's really important point about the data that goes into any model, especially an AI model, needs to be in good shape if you're going to expect it to be able to help you generate meaningful results. One of the other things that comes up in the ebook is benchmarking as a way to use some of the learning data. And I think that's really interesting because I do think that benchmarking can be really powerful and can be useful, but it also seems like sometimes benchmarking can kind of create a bit of a uneven comparison, right? Like an apples to oranges kind of problem. So what does it take to benchmark meaningfully, and what makes those benchmarking comparisons valuable and useful rather than maybe misleading? I'm being compared to not really a similar organization or a similar situation or a similar learning product.
Yeah, benchmarking is one of those things. It's incredibly powerful when it's done right. And on the flip, it can be quite dangerous when it's done wrong, because like you alluded to, a bad comparison can give you false confidence in a data set that you're looking at. So performance data is definitely valuable, but performance data with context is even more powerful. So a few things I would say make it real. First is kind of the breadth of context. So the comparison has to be grounded in data that spans, whether it's learner groups or industries. And if it's too narrow, it can mislead. And so second, if you're comparing similar courses or benchmarking for us, different organizations or cohorts, that really makes the kind of the peer comparison done right. And the key with all of that is just the consistent definitions part. Completion has to mean the same thing on both ends of what you're comparing. And historical trends can also show you the real improvement over time. Often, even in our leadership meetings, it's like, okay, well, X% is really great, but what does that really mean in context? And so, the differentiator for us is understanding how adult learners and customers actually engage and not just the technology that tracks them. So, yeah, benchmarking is truly useful when you're comparing the like to like. Otherwise, you can generate very confident but also wrong conclusions.
And I do think that's an interesting thing that Holmes Corporation, and because you work with a variety of different organizations, you do have that ability to draw on data from different organizations and do some of that benchmarking of program to program, organization to organization. Do you also find at times that it's useful to benchmark within a singular association, to kind of look at their own program A versus program B versus kind of looking at association A and association B?
Yeah, that's exactly it. The nature of our association partners in different verticals, it allows that high level view, but to exactly your question, drilling down within a particular industry, within a particular partner across products. And it is interesting. You'll see different trends where, even if the products are designed similarly or with similar functions, based on the content, they interact completely different. So that's, I would say, one of the biggest values for us is being able to do those comparisons and, looking at equal time frames and just kind of those other environmental factors as well.
One of the other things that I found very interesting in the ebook is this finding around the connection between membership status and learning. So could you talk a little bit about this value of membership integrated learning? I think that's how the ebook put it.
Yeah. In our experience, here's something associations have always believed, but couldn't always prove. When we look across partner programs in our own analysis, time and time again, members outperform non-members on success rates, even before you factor in product engagement. And so we know association partners that we work with have just so much knowledge and industry authority. It becomes kind of this virtuous cycle where, membership can unlock the learning drives engagement, and then engagement ultimately drives renewal and credential revenue. And so that, when you finally get that one kind of unified view of the member, the whole journey, instead of, having learning sit in one silo, membership in another, that single consolidated view is really where the personalization starts. And it means you can recommend the next relevant product or credential and not just truly blast the whole catalog. And I would say that learning is one of the stickiest reasons a member renews. You weave it in, and every course can make someone engaged and more credentialed, and then ultimately more likely to stay.
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's often talked about. I think that relationship between membership and learning and how they are this nice virtuous cycle if you get them going. But as you said, to have some of that data to be able to look at that and then sort of prove that that's more than just a hunch or the way that it might work, that it actually is the way that it's working, that those people who are members do seem to engage more or do better in the learning. One of the other things that the ebook talks about is what it takes for an organization to be ready to shift to this data-driven approach to learning. And there's at least two parts to that, right? There's at least the technology side of it, and then there's at least a cultural or sort of, a cultural part to it as well. So in your experience, is it the technology issues or the cultural issues that make it harder to shift to a data-driven approach to learning?
I love this question. And as I mentioned, I'm a tech guy. So people probably that know me would expect me to say technology, but I feel that it's really not. It's culture every time. And the ebook talks explicitly about this, and technology alone isn't enough. So we outlined some of the readiness pillars near and dear to my heart. Data literacy. Can your stakeholders actually read what's on these dashboards that you're creating and understand it? Process adaptation. Do the workflows change around insights? I talked earlier about actionable insights from the data, and then kind of the organization wide or the cultural commitment, and do you act on what you see? And the technology is absolutely necessary, but I would say that those three are what separate different organizations that truly win. And when you have a dashboard that contradicts maybe a senior leader's kind of gut intuition, and the room might just default to that, but I would say that's kind of the cultural gap, not a technology gap. And so my favorite line is, it takes leadership to model that behavior. And once teams really trust the data, then there's this shared willingness to let the numbers challenge all the kind of everyday assumptions. And then it kind of creates this culture that makes it safe to say, oh, yeah, I was wrong. And, you can buy a platform, but you can't buy willingness to trust in the numbers. And when it tells you something that you didn't necessarily want to hear.
So for a learning business leader who is going, okay, I get it. I understand the value of becoming more data-driven, data-informed, but maybe she's not sure where to begin. So what would you recommend as a first step to get a little bit closer to being more data-informed, data-driven about decisions?
Well, first thing I would say, and I get asked that question a lot, just kind of in my journey. And I think the most common mistake is thinking you need out of the gate a giant platform and this brilliantly designed master plan, and you really don't. And I'll get to why I think this way. So I would say, don't start with the platform, but start with a question you wish you could answer. The momentum, and just in my experience, kind of ultimately builds that master plan. I mean, you have kind of the framework and a roadmap for sure. So pick something that is concrete and that you wish you could answer. So which of our learners or which segments are most likely not to finish and why? And then you chase the data to answer that. You don't have to have everything unified on day one to start out. And the ebook goes into, we provide a little checklist of starter questions. Can you get to real-time data without manual report pulls? Or can you predict risk with enough ramp and lead time? Can you automate support, so you're freeing up kind of organizationally wide time? Do you have that peer benchmarking for context? And any one of those, I would say, is a fine front door. The reason I push more for that one question is just momentum, and each small win kind of builds that larger belief and, quite frankly, the budget for a larger investment in the future.
That answer reminds me of AI not being apparent in the ebook. I mean, it's there and sort of in the background, that having a question to start with sort of echoes that it's about the purpose. What are you trying to do, rather than focusing on the tools or the specific methodologies?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. It, just like AI, it starts with a prompt. I mean, you might know where you're trying to go, but you kind of build momentum with, oh, I didn't think of it in this way. So it kind of leads it with that excitement and that full end-to-end journey.
Because this is the Leading Learning Podcast, we always like to ask guests who come on about their own approach to learning. So, Steven, what are some of your specific habits or practices or sources as you continue to grow and learn professionally and personally?
So one of my favorite learning experiences most recently has been coding with my son. He's really big into Roblox. And I know it sounds silly, but And wrangling that with him honestly sharpens how I think about logic and systems in ways that maybe my day job doesn't, even though I am kind of, like I said, a tech geek. But that's kind of my whole approach. I learn best kind of hands-on building things, and projects honestly teach me a lot more than maybe a certain course would, just with that hands-on approach. And I deliberately cross-pollinate. You've heard I am a sports guy, so I pull a ton. I used to coach my daughter's basketball team, so I like to think of data in that context as with teams. And I try to pull from a lot of different perspectives before locking into my first instinct. And I always try to maintain a thirst for additional knowledge. So I listen to podcasts, attend webinars, conferences. So I'm probably too many, but I'm on a lot of newsletter lists, and I always try to stay up to date on the latest trends and even test drive new products that interest me. And so if I had to sum it up, my best learning habit is staying a little uncomfortable, because if I'm in a room and I understand everything, then I'd be in the wrong room.
That wraps up my conversation with Steven Khraiss of Holmes Corporation. Stick around for our recap.
You can find show notes and a transcript for this episode at leadinglearning.com/episode 485, along with a link to the ebook and to Steven's LinkedIn profile. And please help us spread the word about the Leading Learning podcast.
Steven believes learning businesses need to stop evaluating programs based on data that only tells them what already happened. By the time a lagging indicator like a completion rate reveals a problem, the window to help learners has often closed.
Holmes made a deliberate choice to leave mention of AI out of the ebook entirely, not because AI isn't relevant, but because, as Steven puts it, AI can be the accelerant, but it can't be the foundation.
His practical first step for any learning business leader who wants to become more data informed but doesn't know how to start is to begin with one question you wish you could answer and then build from there. I love that recommendation because he's saying essentially, start with curiosity.
Thanks for listening, and see you next time on the Leading Learning Podcast.